Welcome to MUFON Los Angeles. Bud Hopkins is a world-renowned artist, author, and pioneer UFO abduction researcher. Having investigated well over 700 cases, he now heads the Intruders Foundation, a non-profit scientific research and support organization. Taken together, his three books, Missing Time in 1981, Intruders in 1987, and Witnessed in 1996, are widely regarded by researchers and skeptics alike as comprising the most influential series of books yet published on the abduction phenomenon. These works, Hopkins' lectures, and his other presentations have been responsible for bringing a number of other noted researchers like Dr. David Jacobs, John Carpenter, and Dr. John Mack, among others, into this extraordinary area of specialization. His documented discoveries have become the basis of many later abduction investigations and research. Bud Hopkins has long been considered one of ufology's most visible figures. He pioneers and continues to lead the investigation into the most controversial aspect of the UFO phenomenon, the systematic abduction of human beings by UFO occupants. As the world premier expert on this issue, over the past 20 years he has worked with more than 1,000 people who have reported abduction experiences. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bud Hopkins.
I want to thank Don and all of you for having invited me, and for all of you to have come tonight. I haven't been out the West Coast for a while. I live in New York City, and I'm always pleased to come here. And I, as an extra bonus, in addition to meeting all of you and having a chance to talk to some of you about your experiences and investigators and so forth, I get to go to the new Getty Museum. I think of Frank Gehry, who was the architect of the San Paulo, the Guggenheim in Mexico. My gosh, am I confusing one thing after another? Sorry about that. I don't know how that happened. I usually keep the tongue straight. I came out here partly because my wife decided it was a good idea to get me out of the house, and she wanted to do the packing. So I have a suitcase that's half filled with candles and flashlights, which is the way we hear about New York. I mean, here I am doing it again. Any rate, it is really a great pleasure to be here. Now, the first thing I'm going to do tonight is just review a little bit about two new cases I'm working on. I think it's always important for people to understand that this is an ongoing enterprise, and that probably, as we figure this out, probably every single day I receive by phone, email, or personal contact at least 2 new potential abduction cases every single day that should be looked into. It's that widespread. And many of these, of course, are from all parts of the world, and therefore I don't have a chance to follow up a great number of them, but we do have a network of people we refer people to who write to us and need some help. But I thought that it is an ongoing thing, and I would just give you a quick outline of 2 recent cases that I'm in the middle of working on that are extremely interesting for 2 different reasons. The first, for those of you who have read the MUFON Journal from time to time, you might have seen an article which actually involved a cover photograph of a UFO seen passing behind a church steeple. This thing was somewhat peanut-shaped. The man who took this videotape of this object in broad daylight was a man in law enforcement, and an extremely credible, very, very fine, very nice person. He had gone out into the backyard while his wife was planting some flowers, and he happened to notice this thing moving along. He ran in the house, got his videotape, came out and took this very interesting film of it, which I unfortunately am not going to be able to show you, but it was reproduced, certain stills, in the MUFON Journal. Now, this has been very thoroughly analyzed by Dr. Bruce Maccabee, who many of you know is a leading optical physicist who has looked into all kinds of films, photographs, videotapes, and so forth. And this is an anomalous large object at some distance moving at an even speed in broad daylight. Very oddly shaped. Interestingly, 2 other photographs have turned up from other sources showing the same kind of vaguely peanut-shaped object. A different type than we usually run into, obviously, of UFO craft. But the point about this is that after this man took the videotape, this is August 2nd, 1998, he didn't say a word to his wife at all. She was planting flowers, and he simply photographed the thing. And he thought it was odd later on, when he thought back, that he never said a word to her about it. But it turned out that she had seen it too. She had looked up. Evidently she saw him with a camera. And he went into the house after he finished filming it. He just walked along towards the house, still filming, just into the garden, without a word, turned the camera off, went in the house, put the camera away. And then he said he really doesn't remember what he did after that. And it turns out that his wife doesn't remember either. And the next day, he didn't even remember that he had taken a videotape of a UFO. And it wasn't until the 8th, which is a number of days later, of August, that he thought, wait a second, I have a videotape of that thing we saw in the yard, and took it out and looked at it. Well, this man, when he contacted me, has had a lot of very interesting experiences from his childhood. And we have since gotten together. I've done an extensive interview, which has been videotaped by my wife, of the interview with him and his wife. And we did a hypnotic regression on this particular experience. And what had happened, what emerged under hypnosis, and I have to tell you, this is a very, very credible man with many experiences in his past. He walked in the house, put the camera away, and then walked into the kitchen, found himself floating upwards, went right straight up through the roof of the kitchen at a slight angle, and as he went straight up in broad daylight, there was this object right above him. And he went straight up into it. Now, the thing that's important about this is the first time we've ever had a case of a man who filmed the very object that he was apparently abducted into. But he filmed it before the abduction occurred. And this has an interesting quality, because you begin to think, why did the UFO, in a certain sense, if it was planning to pick him up, why did it allow itself to be videotaped? Was this some kind of deliberate act on its part? And in this sense, there's a certain odd little way it connects with the account that I wrote about and witnessed of the Linda Cortila case, which it's another case where the UFO occupants apparently allowed witnesses deliberately to see what was happening. But we have now a videotape of the very craft that took this man away. Very interesting case, lots more to it. But anyway, I'm in the middle of it right now, just to fill you in on something new. Another case that I'm working on is interesting for a different reason. This particular man is in his middle 40s. He's a businessman. And he finally wrote to me after years and years of hemming and hawing and worrying about it. He had had 2 experiences that he remembered extremely vividly and consciously in his earlier years. One of them involved his driving with his brother and their wives when they were in their 20s towards Palm Springs from Las Vegas, where they'd been spending a couple of days in a weekend vacation. And his memory was, and actually it's the memory of the other 3 in the car, was that at some point on a detour that they took, because they were told this was a shortcut to get to Palm Springs, and this would have been about 9 or 10 in the morning, on this detour where they saw very little other traffic, all of a sudden the car was pulled off the road. He was driving, the car stopped, and consciously he remembered, I won't go into the details, he remembered the object approaching the car, very, very large, with the silhouettes of figures in the window of the UFO. He said it was maybe 40 or 50 feet off the ground. And they have no more memory except another memory from a later time of the thing off in the distance and leaving. And when they got back together in their minds and collected themselves, they realized it was getting dark. It was nighttime. And the incident had started 9 or 10 in the morning. There was a huge period of missing time. All four of them went immediately to a motel. They spent the whole night awake, talking in a great deal of confusion, self-doubt, fear, everything else. He's had a number of experiences, but this is the important point about this. And as I say, he has been backed up by the other three witnesses in this case on all the details. But he has suffered a lot of psychological difficulties, emotional difficulties, and in particular, he's had a lot of problems dealing with strangers, dealing with people he's not familiar with, which is a kind of a difficult thing because, in effect, he's in sales. That's the nature of his business. So he'd been seeing a psychotherapist for about 3 years, and they'd been working on this problem of just simply this issue of how to get along with strangers and how to not be panicked and frightened and so forth. Finally, when he wrote to me and decided to come, I asked him, of course, when we were doing a long interview, if he'd talked to his therapist about these experiences that he remembered. There was another one from a missing time experience from an earlier period of his life. And he said he had never brought these up. And he said that he mentioned finally at the end to his therapist that he was going to come and see me, and told the therapist a little bit about what this was all about, finally. And that it had taken 3 years to do that. And the therapist was supportive, he said, of his coming to see me. So we did a hypnotic regression about this incident on the way to Palm Springs. And in that particular incident, as the car was pulled off the road and stopped, at the very outset of this moment of the incipient abduction, he went into a state of absolute panic, which was extraordinary. And it took me, and he immediately brought himself out of the trance state. He shook and he was crying. I had to get a blanket. He was in a state of shock, really. He was freezing cold. He was feeling a kind of an electrical charge going through him. It was an extremely unusually intense reaction. And this is a very nice man. I spent the next 2 or 3 hours with him, keeping him calm and so forth. I insisted that he talk to his therapist when he got home that day. And I called him and I said, did you ask him how he was doing, how he was feeling? He was still extremely shaky. Did you talk to your therapist? He said yes. And I said, well, what did your therapist say? And he said he believed me that this happened. It turns out the therapist was an expert in handling cases of post-traumatic stress disorder. He'd worked with a lot of Vietnam vets. And he recognized the symptoms, and essentially that was his diagnosis for this man, even though they could not find the trauma that this was supposed to be the result of. And so when he told the therapist what had happened, the therapist immediately felt this explains a great deal of his behavior and his problems. And I said, well, that's wonderful. And he said, no, it isn't. And I said, why not? He said, well, I broke all future appointments with a therapist, and I've refused to see him, and I don't want to see him anymore. And I said, why? And he said, because I wanted him to tell me that this was a psychological problem, not reality. Now, could you imagine, we have so many people who are with a therapist who completely discounts what they're saying. And there's always that problem. This can't have happened to you because such things don't happen. And here's a man who has a supportive therapist, but wanted to hear the opposite. He wanted to hear that this was something which was healable in earthly terms. Anyway, there's a lot more going on with his case and with the other case, and I am almost always working with about 5 or 6 people at any given period, over weeks, months, years even. So it's a day in and day out situation. Anyway, what I want to talk to you about tonight in a central way, has to do with issues of the way human beings develop from childhood, as the psychologists tend to view it. There are certain models of developmental models of how the personality changes from infancy on, and how this interacts with the abduction phenomenon, which in my experience is something which almost always begins in infancy or childhood. Very often people say to me, do you think that these people who are having these experiences are selected for certain qualities they have? And I said, well, that's certainly possibly true. We don't really know. We do know about, of course, the fact of bloodline being a reason why people are abducted, because children of abductees are often in that going through that same experience. But I said you always have to realize it's the chicken and the egg issue. If a certain person is 37 years old and they're a certain way, they have been shaped partly by their abduction experiences. It isn't something that you can notice a quality in that person and say, oh, that's why the aliens are interested. The aliens may have contributed to the way that person appears. So I decided to look into some of the ways in which children are seen to develop according to different psychologists, but in particularly, I was using Erik Erikson's whole schema of development, which is a fairly commonly accepted one. And I'm going to show examples of how children react at different ages, things that happen to them, and see that against what should be the normal child's development. And that normal development, how it is, in a sense, impacted upon by the UFO experiences. This is extremely important because by the time a child reaches the age of 10 or so, obviously, many, many basic traits are virtually set in stone at that point. I don't want to make it sound that absolute. And therefore, if the experiences that child has had as a little person, a very small person, have had an enormous effect, we have to look very seriously at that when we look at how the person has certain presenting symptoms and manifestations as an adult. Now, what I would like to do here is to take different stages of a child's life as they were laid out in this particular pattern that Erik Erikson developed. He starts with infancy, naturally, and he really says infancy, as he defines it, is the first year of life of a child. Then the next period that he uses is, he calls early childhood, and that's essentially roughly the child's second and third years of life. Then play age is a term he uses for roughly 3, 4, 5 years old. School age, of course, is going to start at 6. And that leads up, of course, in a long arc towards adolescence. We're going to start with these early periods of development of a child. Now, the interesting thing about this is we know children are being abducted as little children. I have cases where children have been abducted as newborn babies out of a hospital. And this is, of course, the testimony coming from the parents, not the child. The evidence, you would think, about an abducted baby is, who doesn't talk, obviously, pre-verbal, is going to be very sketchy. But it really isn't, because we have enormous amounts of testimony from the mothers, from the fathers, from the babysitters, from pediatricians, etc., relatives. One thing I remember so vividly was a young woman I was working with, and I asked her if she had had any odd experiences when she was very little that she could remember that just seemed odd and something she couldn't explain. And she couldn't think of anything from when she was very little. She was having a lot of other experiences later on. So I said, well, ask your mother the next time you talk to her on the phone. And she called me very upset because she had asked her mother very casually, saying, you know, when I was a little kid, not telling her about UFO anything, suspicions, she said, was there anything funny that happened to me that I should know about that doesn't make much sense? And her mother said, well, there certainly was. She said, 3 different times we put you to bed in your crib when you were 6 months old or whatever, and 3 different times I got up to check on you and found you on the floor wrapped up in a little blanket. Now, if you're a 3-month-old baby or whatever, you don't get out of a crib. John Mack once told me about one of his clients finding their baby wrapped up in a blanket on the stairs. This was, again, like a 6-month-old baby on the... So you have these displacements that don't make any sense. Another thing, of course, is that you have situations where a child turns up with physical marks. We have cases where the child is found, a tiny little baby, outside in the middle of the night, and the child's pajamas are on backwards or whatever, and there's a little cut or a scoop mark or something. There's all kinds of testimony of that sort suggesting that something's going on. But there's another issue here, and if we can have the slides. Just want to illustrate some of this as best we can. Are we on there? Yeah, I think we're going to have to cut the lights down.
Anybody know where the lights are?
Yeah.
Well, it's completely down.
Okay.
That's what we got, on and off.
Okay. This is a little ploy by which I get to show you a photograph of my wife. Actually, what I'm showing you here has to do with the fact that I have had 3 different cases, 3 different women I've worked with, who had very tiny children, tiny babies, and they all said that whenever, that they had this terrible experience with the child, that whenever they put on their dark glasses, the child would absolutely rebel, screaming in terror. These are women who took their glasses, they would try to show them to the child, move them around, and then the child is watching. This is, let's say it's a 6-month-old baby, and as soon as the glasses went on and these big dark eyes replaced mommy's eyes, there was enormous terror. We have many cases where the child is afraid to go to bed in his or her crib, but is screaming and crying. In one particular case, and it's a very interesting thing that moves from one stage to another, there's a situation of a young man, abductee. His newborn baby, as the child, was, let's say, 2 and 3 and 4 months, would scream and cry whenever anybody went near the Venetian blinds in the room and touched them or there was any noise. The child reacted with great terror. And he said finally, as the child got older and was able to talk, whenever anybody stood near the Venetian blinds, the kid would point and say, "Monster, monster." Now, we have, this is a case from Australia. This woman was abducted at the age of about 6 months, and this incision was made on her leg. And I can't, in these cases, to go through this as quickly as I need to, I can't give all the background of these cases. You'll have to take my word. That's a close-up picture of this. Now, the point I would like to make here, having to do with tiny children, is that according to the model set up by Erik Erikson, he has an idea that at each stage of development, the child should master a certain emotion or issue or whatever. And that's the way the child, having mastered that, moves on to the next stage. And he said at first, the first stage, the child has to, as a tiny baby, simply learn trust, which then can generate a kind of hope, a kind of sense of I suppose, an optimistic view of seeing the world. The child has to trust that when the arms reach out to take the child out of the bed, that it's mommy or daddy or somebody who loves that child. And his point is that if that trust does not build up, the child's sense of hope and of feeling comfortable with the outer world begins to shrink. And it's my belief that many, many abductees at the very outset of their lives, have that kind of trust and hope somewhat crushed or somewhat atrophied because of the experiences they're going through. Now, these are children who cannot speak. These are little tiny children. But the kind of fear that manifests itself over and over again with these tiny children is something which obviously doesn't breed a kind of hopeful, happy, together older child. And trust is an extremely important element, of course, in life, kind of hopefulness. Back in 1981 or 82, I was involved in a project to do some psychological testing of abductees. We hired a psychologist named Elizabeth Slater, and what we did was an absolutely blind test. We told her we had this group of people, we wanted her to administer the standard battery psychological tests, the MMPI and the Rorschach and the TAT and so forth. And we didn't tell her anything about this group, nothing about UFOs, nothing about anything. And since she did some of the testing in my studio, I think she thought vaguely this had to do with creativity and art or something, which is fine. At any rate, we told her just two things. We're interested in any psychopathology that would turn up in testing these people, because as you know, we all remember the late Carl Sagan. Every time he mentioned abduction, it was hallucination, you know, the way he talked, delusion. Unfortunately, that's diagnosing people he's never met for national TV, which is, I think, an unconscionable act. But at any rate, the thought that these people are having some kind of psychological problem. So we wanted to test to see if there are any major mental illnesses afoot here. The second thing was we wanted to know if there are any patterns. And she found when she tested the people that there was no mental illness, no psychopathology of any heavy sense whatsoever. But she said in terms of patterns, there were three deficits, the euphemism, the term that they use, that all of the abductees shared. All had low self-esteem. Even some of these people were extremely talented and successful and so on, but their self-image was, again, atrophied. The second thing was they all had problems feeling at home in their bodies, feeling a sense of control, feeling a sense that they owned their bodies. There was a certain dissociation between the physical and their sense of self. Even the sexuality was a problem in those issues. And the third thing was they all had a major trouble with trust and with relationships. So we know that this, and this has been borne out in other tests, working with other abductees. This was a blind test. She had no idea what these people have been through. But my point is that if those are basic characteristics of many, many abductees, and I think they are, that's been my experience over 25 years, then we have to look at some of the causes. And my point here is that when we go back to these early childhood experiences, I think we can account for some of these problems developing in the very, very first years of life. Now this is, what we're doing here is talking about infancy. Now we're going to move on to a little bit later stage, which is early childhood. This is the second and third year of life, and of course at this point the child is beginning to be verbal, at least to some extent. But at this point we have another issue that, according to Eric Erikson, should be developing. If hope is the main thing that should be developing with infants, which it really is, then here we want the child has to learn a certain kind of autonomy. The child is learning at this point to control its body, its sphincters, its ability to reach out and grab something it likes or push something away it doesn't like. It begins to be able to physically react. It learns how to walk. It learns how to move. The child learns how to control its own body. Now, that's the second stage that he develops. And of course, if there is no autonomy developing in a fully healthy way, he points out the opposite is a sense of shame and a sense of incompetence and a sense of helplessness and so forth. Now, it's a very interesting thing here that when you get to this issue of autonomy, control over the body, you have a situation where these little children, 2 and 3, when they're being abducted, are being paralyzed. They can't move. They're being taken out of their cribs or wherever, out of the sandbox or wherever they're taken from, taken into craft. They are unable to move, and their bodies have various kinds of physical and physically invasive procedures taking place. This child is trying to learn how to use its arms and legs and its voice and to express itself through through control of its body, and its control is being taken away from it. Now, that certainly cannot possibly be helpful in developing in that child a sense of autonomy. It just isn't going to work. And if, of course, this has to do with, on the most basic level, things like controlling its sphincters, toilet training, being able to walk well and all this, all of those things are going to be more difficult for the abductee child than for someone who's not going through this. And when Dr. Slater told me about the problem that she'd noticed in abductees when she was testing them, not knowing they were abductees, that their physical, their sense of owning their bodies and controlling their bodies was very deficient. For instance, you don't run into many abductees who are great basketball players or great gymnasts or something of that sort. As a matter of fact, in a very funny way, I once, just out of curiosity, asked my support group one night, we had a whole group of people sitting around, I said, when you were kids or now or early or whatever, what kind of sports were you good at? And I started with one person, and that woman said, oh, I was really a terrific runner. I was the fastest runner there ever was in our school. And the next kid said, you know, it's funny, I was really good as a runner too. I went out for track. We went around the room, and it began to be funny. Everybody was good at getting the hell out of there. And the funny thing was, once I interviewed a psychiatrist who was an abductee, and he said it was really funny that I had brought that up because he said, I run in marathons every chance I get. But he said, I have another sport I'm very good at. He said, I'm studying martial arts. So he said, flight or fight. He said, I got both ends covered here. And he never realized that that's what he was doing. But the point here is that, as Dr. Slater said, if you imagine 2 children, she was trying to illustrate this for me. She said that they're athletic little kids and they're 10 years old, and one of them has a terrible accident, has a compound fracture of the leg or something. That child will never feel as in control of his body and rely upon it as unselfconsciously as the child who has not had that kind of an accident. That child will always look a little nervously upon his own body as to whether or not it is going to let him down. And if you then extrapolate from that into the UFO experience, somebody who has been, upon intervals, paralyzed, moved around, poked and prodded, that person is also, there's no possible way that person could have the same kind of self-confidence when it comes to the physical side of his or her personality as one who hasn't. Now, I can speak to this from a personal perspective because when I was 2.5 years old, I had polio. And I didn't walk for about a year and a half. I had a brace on my leg. And I know that I grew up myself never feeling that my body was something I could totally rely upon. I didn't have that. So I know what that's like. I know that that sort of thing exists. But as children are growing up, one of the things that happens is in this situation where autonomy as another developmental stage is somehow marred by the UFO abduction experience. And incidentally, I'm not trying to say the aliens, the UFO occupants, are saying we're going to come down there and make it difficult for these kids to grow up normally. That's not what I think is deliberately happening. This is what you might call collateral damage. They do what they do, but the damage that they're doing, I think, is quite major in the case of many, many, many people. But one of the things that happens that I've been interested in is the fact that there are children who develop all kinds of fears around this time, 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, fears that they don't quite understand but make a lot of sense. Now, the man that I was working with at one point told me that he had a terrible fear as a child of going into the living room and seeing the lamps turned on in the living room. And he couldn't figure out what he was afraid of. And finally, he took this picture and sent it to me. And he said he realized when he's back in his old home, looking at the lamps in the living room, he realized that what the problem was the shape of the light as it hit the wall and the ceiling. The shape of it was the shape of the head of these figures that he was afraid of. And it was as if cast on the wall was a huge silhouette of what he saw as one of the heads that frightened him so much as a small child. Oh, sorry. This is a wig stand, one of those plastic wig stands that people have. And this particular child fished this wig stand out of the garbage and of some neighbor's house and painted these eyes on it and put it up in the room. And her father told me that she spent inordinate amounts of time staring at this because it fascinated her and frightened her at the same time. And he had, the same individual had 2 younger children who were twins, who were just toddlers, and neither one of them could tolerate looking at the thing. They would burst into tears and scream and hide and so forth. These objects, the way in which objects from everyday life get pulled into the world of the abduction experience, it can be extremely telling. The side view. It's interesting you notice that there's no mouth or nose on this, just the eyes. We'll get to this in just a moment. Now, we start with infancy, the problems, hope being shattered in a certain sense, or at least damaged because of the problems that the child is undergoing. Then the sense of physical autonomy, which the 2- and 3-year-olds should be learning, and the damage that's done to that. When we move ahead to the stage called early childhood, when children are quite young, these children are barely into that, they're almost out of it already. You get into a situation where the child is now learning to talk, to deal with adults, to deal with parents and so forth, to ask for things, to get things back, to play the kinds of verbal games that a 2- or 3-year-old child, 4- and 5-year-old child, for those of you who have such a little person at home, or once did, you know the games that they can play. There's a kind of learning how to negotiate with the outside world. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this to me is that as soon as the child begins to be able to talk and sort of deal with the outside world, the UFO occupants start playing a different game. Instead of simply taking the child and doing what they do and returning the child, they start to do a kind of verbal involvement with that child. And this is where the first stories start. Many, many, many children have been told by the UFO occupants all kinds of wonderfully flattering things. You belong to us, you come from the stars, you're one of our people, you're very special. How many abductees, before they began to realize how widespread the phenomenon was, how many thought, I'm a very special person, I was taken and they have some job for me to do, and this is going to be wonderful, even though I've been through a lot of hell, but this is going to be wonderful because they told me it is. I'm very special. And then you find out you're one of maybe millions of people. How special can you be? It's a very large minority group. But the point is that the games start here. And one of the most interesting things to me, just a personal little story, had to do with a woman whose daughter was about 2, just beginning to talk, and was absolutely terrified when she saw either the front of Strieber's book or the front of my book or something, saw the alien head. This is years ago, screaming, crying, that's him, that's the monster, Mommy. He takes me up in the sky. He takes me to see the doctor. He takes my jammies off. He hurts me. This little girl showed me the puncture marks in her abdomen and so forth. This at 2.5 or 3 when I was interviewing her. She was extremely frightened by all these experiences. Then she got a little bit older, and then the game started. And she decided that the little man that came to take her up to the sky through the light was a really wonderful person, and he loved her, and she loved him, and he was really a good person and nice, and she named him Kevin. Kevin was probably a kid in her class she liked or something like that, but this was Kevin. And he was really nice. He was her best friend. And I said, well, how's he your best friend? Well, he told me he's my best friend, and he told me he loves me. And I said, well, that's very nice. And I said, what happens when he takes you up into the light, as she described it? And she said, well, he takes me up to his place, his house is round, but she said, there are bad Kevins up there. And the bad Kevins hurt me, and they scare me. But Kevin, the good Kevin, he's nice to me and brings me back. And he tells me he loves me. Now, we've already got a kind of a good cop, bad cop thing going here, which is extremely subtle, extremely playful, extremely controlling, not playful. But it is in the area of play, really, for these little children whose imagination at this particular stage of life is 4 and 5 and so on, is all over the place. Children's thoughts, they have invisible playmates, they live in a kind of a wonderful world of fantasy and so on, where the dividing lines between fantasy and reality are very unclear. So in a certain sense, it gives the aliens an entree into the manipulation of that child. Incidentally, the way the child's mind changes and how it begins to process what's happening is extremely interesting. One story, I was working with a man who told me that when he was little, very little, he had a problem of bedwetting, which continued longer than it should. He was very frightened to sleep in his room. He didn't want to get out of bed to go to the bathroom and whatnot. It was a big problem. And then that ended. And he was okay for a while, and he began to think that everything was fine. And he had some kind of pleasant memories of these odd experiences. They weren't clear, but they were pleasant. And then one day, he watched his favorite TV program, and I've forgotten what it was, but it was something like a Twilight Zone type of thing. And he said there was one program which absolutely terrified him. At this point, he was about 10 or 11. And this was a program in which a rocket ship went up from the United States with astronauts, and they were going to land on Mars. And they landed on Mars, and they were kidnapped by these evil Martians. And so back on Earth, we didn't know what happened to our, this is the first missing Martian probe, I guess. But we didn't know what had happened to this crew, so we sent up a second crew, and they were captured too. And it was a very, very scary program to him, and he said he thinks about it all the time. It scared him to death, even though this was his favorite series on television. And he said the problem was, immediately after this, I saw this program, he said, I had trouble sleeping for, well, the next couple of years. And he said, and I got back into the habit of wetting the bed every night until I was about 15. I was afraid to get out of bed, as if somehow or other the different stages that he was going through with the abduction experiences, once he worked through different attitudes about it and got to this one moment where he felt, I suppose, he can't really quite trust him, then the problem started up again. And when it comes to trust, I always like to remind everybody that the two groups never ever to believe just in any a priori way, anything they say about the phenomenon of the United States government and the aliens themselves, because these two groups have a terrible, terrible record of lying and deceit and manipulation, both of them. But at any rate, we're moving from these little preschool children who are being verbal and wanting to learn how to control their bodies, the whole world of autonomy and so forth, and how the problems that can result from having these things taken away from them and being tricked in a verbal way. And I remember how often that doesn't work, because Carla Turner, the late Carla Turner, once said that her very first conscious memory of UFO experiences being outside in a field with some tall 7-foot looking sort of a praying mantis looking thing, she said, and it was trying to tell me it was my mother. And in many cases, children fully believe that these are their parents, because the aliens told them that. And you have to realize too that for a child, despite all of these really unfortunate aspects of the experience, the child is also in a magical world. They go up a beam of light, they're looking down at their house from 40 feet off the ground and never seen that before, and they're taken inside, and everything is kind of magical looking. So there is a kind of a benefit that they're living a very strange life which has its magical component at the same time that they're going through lots and lots of problems. So at any rate, we get to looking at the stage of play age is the area I was talking about before the school years start. The play age, which is when this kind of fantasy life develops. So we get to the place now of going into school and the school years. The thing that the child has to learn in school is a sort of competence at solving problems and issues. Things are given to them, color this in and keep the blue inside the black lines, a simple thing. How to add, how to write your name. That simple sense of competence that you have to learn in doing physical tasks in school. And of course, if you don't learn the competence, just like if you don't learn a sense of autonomy about your body, you don't learn a sense of trust, at each step of the way, you're being held back from a normal development by the effect of these experiences. So you get to school and you're supposed to be learning how to do things, and you're supposed to be feeling very competent. But one of the problems for children who are having UFO experiences is that they don't feel very competent by the time they get to school, and they don't feel very often that they can do these problems of these tests, and they're filled with shame and a sense of failure, a sense that they just can't hack it, they can't do it, and often either don't do well in school, or at least they don't do as well as they should be doing in school, considering their innate gifts. And this is, of course, something that extends right up through a period of later years when a child is reaching adolescence, and then you have puberty looming and everything gets even worse. There was a writer, incidentally, Brendan Gill, a New Yorker writer, who was once, because he came from a very wealthy family, he was once accused of not being a profound enough writer because he had always had money and wealth and so forth, and he hadn't had enough tragedy in his life to make it his writing serious enough, deep enough. And he said, I think that's ridiculous. He said, I think anybody who's lived past the age of 10 has had enough tragedy in his life to last a lifetime for anybody, no matter how much money there was. So essentially, the problems of childhood, the normal child problems, the normal issues that come up all the time, are existing for abductees and for non-abductees alike. But for the abductees, they're an extra problem on top of everything else that they're going through. Now, I want to show a couple pictures here. These little children I worked with at one point, And the little boy, they were both having abduction experiences. I asked him to make a drawing of what the figure looked like that used to come and take him at night out the door. And so he sat down, he made this little drawing for me. And when you begin to analyze the drawing, it's the thing that looks like hair is, he said, that's light coming off it. It was glowing. And he drew the head, then he drew the eyes, and then he drew the glowing light. Then he put the mouth in, and I think that's probably just a way to make the whole thing more fierce. He sticks the arms out like that, as if it's eating into the space around it. And the legs are just kind of an afterthought. But when he made this rather fierce-looking drawing, I thought, well, I really need him to show me what a sort of a baseline drawing is, what he, although he didn't use that phrase, how he would draw a normal picture of a normal person. I said, why don't you do another drawing for me now of your little sister? So he made this drawing. When I asked him what that thing was sticking up the top of her head, he said, well, that's her ponytail, but you can't see it. Children are amazingly accurate about this. But at any rate, this is very sweet. She has a sweet little smile. The interesting thing is when you compare them, you can see how fiercely the top figure takes up the space, reaches out at you leeringly or whatever. And this little girl, her arms are down. She's much smaller on the page. She's certainly the opposite of being frightened. But very often, through even a psychiatrist friend of mine who's worked with a number of children, has worked with these two, and they used puppet therapy, where they had little alien dolls and dolls representing them and so forth, and it was extremely interesting to watch. He told me how their play illustrated what they were going through, and it was very helpful to them. These two children are now in junior high. I think one is in high school, and they're having a lot of problems right now still. They moved away, and now he's working with them again. Now, just on the physical level here, away from the psychological level, you have these sorts of problems happening all the time. This scoop mark turned up on a 5-year-old, and this was healed virtually overnight. The father had taken this little boy to a dermatologist because of some condition he had, and the dermatologist gave him some salve. This had to do with a rash or something, and said to come back in 5 days. And when he came back 5 days later, this mark was there, which hadn't been there 5 days earlier. And the dermatologist said, what in the world caused this? And he said, I have no idea. And he said, but it wasn't here 5 days ago. It's all healed. And of course, there was no real normal explanation for this, since he had been examined in this area by a doctor one day, and 5 days later re-examined, and that's what it looked like. But if these things are happening on a physical plane, and the child cannot resist, cannot object, is maybe tricked into accepting this, you have a very conflicted and very frightened child. This is another drawing that a child has done, and the point here is children's attention to details has to do with what they render details in the order of importance that they see them. And for those of you, again, who were, anyone in the audience who was once a child, you will find, and so that always reminds me of the story that somebody talked about Abraham Lincoln being born and raised into a log cabin, born into this log cabin that he had built with his own 2 hands. But a child, when they draw, the youngest child starts with what is the simplest, most important thing, and that is a vague, lumpy circle, which is somebody's head, mommy's head, say. The next thing a child learns how to do a little bit later is to put in eyes, because that's mommy looking at you, and the child understands the value of eye contact. So eyes are next. Then the child puts in a mouth, because the child eats and mommy talks, and so the mouth is the next most important thing. Ears and noses come in much, much later. The next thing a child almost always does, hands and arms are terribly important. So he puts the hands and arms in, but no body. They come out of the head. Later the body comes in, but the child is proceeding in terms of what's important. Well, when you look at drawings that children make of aliens, the basic controlling fact of those eyes, those huge black eyes. It's another drawing. A psychotherapist who is an abductee, who I've worked with, has kept this object, a ceramic, on her desk all her life. She didn't know why she found it so compelling. It was made by her daughter, who is going through the same kinds of experiences when the daughter was a tiny child. And the daughter said, "This is an owl, Mommy." And again, it has one feature, really. That's it, these eyes. But oddly, it connected with the mother in a very powerful way. One little boy made this drawing, which I find very touching. He remembered being taken into a ship, and he saw a little boy who he knew in the neighborhood on this table. And notice the table is a solid block, as it's often described in abduction cases. And the alien figure, you see, has one huge eye because the child was trying to do a profile. So he puts a big frontal eye and a profile head, which is something the Egyptians never got out of. But what's happening is the doctor alien type is putting some kind of a needle into this corner of this child's eye. And this little boy witnessed this and was terrified for months after about his own eye, as if something was going to happen to him. But the drawings are, I think, wonderful illustrations of what children think about when they have these experiences. It isn't very pleasant. Now, another area of evidence that has to do with things that happen to children is that very often little children, we believe, although the evidence isn't nearly as strong here as in other areas, but we believe they have often implants put into their bodies. And I'll tell you the story of this particular event. This is a 5-year-old child whose father was in the army in Europe, and this little girl and her parents went on a vacation to Italy, and while they were in Italy she had some kind of an accident on her bicycle or something and hit her head, and they were afraid that she might have fractured her skull. She was taken to the hospital, and the x-rays, of which this is one, turned up a strange object. It's on the left side in the eye socket. I'll have to point it out here. That object, a metallic, squarish object, turned up on the x-ray. Now, another x-ray was done. The first was done looking up from under the child's chin, and the next was taken from down at a very steep angle at the top of the head. As you can see, you can get a sense three-dimensionally where the object is. And in this profile shot, you can see it very clearly. This little girl, the doctor came out, and I have a radiological report in Italian that describes this object. The doctors didn't know what it was, and of course it's the kind of thing that couldn't be in a child's head through an accident without a mark being left, and it was in a very dangerous place. But when the child was taken back to Germany, and the child, of course, did not have a skull fracture and was okay, the father decided to take the child into a military hospital for another set of x-rays, and they did, and there was nothing there. And as in many cases, it seems that it's as if the aliens are aware when an X-ray is taken and they remove the thing somehow. How it goes in and goes out, we don't know. But all of these things are kind of outward manifestations of the physical problems that the child is being subjected to, is undergoing. Here's another mark from a slightly older child. This is actually from the Kathy Davis case that I wrote about in Intruders. But I would also like to say a little bit more about the kind of trickery that goes on with what children are told by the UFO occupants in this manipulative thing. One really touching example to me had to do with a woman I was working with who, her mother told me this story, that when this little girl was about 3, she went on a trip with her parents to her grandparents to the seashore, and evidently she woke up and there were these little people at the window, and they were her friends, and they told her that they were going to take her outside and they would have fun, and she was very excited, and she went outside with them, and they went down to the beach, and there was this big round object parked there, and she was having a wonderful time, and they went up into this thing, and all of a sudden she was put on a table, and she didn't like this. This all emerged under hypnosis later on, but she remembered it, at least a little bit of it, consciously, but how it surfaced is, I'll tell you in a minute. But at any rate, she was put on the table, and her leg was cut, and it hurt her, and she was crying, and she felt they had tricked her. And little children can be very, very immediately angry and hurt when they feel tricked on a situation like that. And she hated them. And they took her back and they put her into her bedroom, and she got out of bed and went to the window and looked out the window and saw this flash of light as the thing was apparently leaving, and she felt incredibly sad because they had left her behind. She wanted to go with them. Now, if you examine something like that in simple psychological terms, this is a really complicated situation that this little girl was being put through. The range of emotions that she was being made to suffer was extreme. There is a tremendously powerful alien manipulation involved, I would imagine, to be able to create sadness in a situation like that when she had felt a few minutes before incredibly angry and tricked. But what happened in this particular case, which was interesting, was she remembered all this consciously at the time it happened, when she was a little girl. She walked into her grandparents' room, she woke them up, and she told them the entire story from beginning to end. And at that point, they of course said, you had a bad dream, you know, all the sorts of things that people tell children. But they remembered it, and when they brought the child home to her mother, they told the mother story, and the mother never forgot the story. The mother herself was an abductee and never forgot the story. But when I began working with her daughter, the daughter didn't remember any of this. The whole story came from the mother until we did the hypnosis. But I'm only citing this to show you the levels of manipulation and emotional complexity that these experiences are causing. The scoop mark situation, which we see over and over again, and these are all in cases where the child had this put in place, usually between, things we're looking at, between the age of about 5 and about 10. That's a more distant shot of one of the ones you just saw. This photograph is very interesting because of these, the three things that look like rather ugly puncture wounds on a man's arm. He received these when he was about 10 years old. And when the photograph was taken, he was in his 50s. And from time to time, he said, these things start to get red, they get swollen, and he went to his doctor for a general checkup and showed him this mark. He also has 2 more on his leg, 2 more triangular patterns of these circular marks, which have been there for decades and decades. But it's a childhood experience. And when he showed them to his doctor, the doctor said, well, how in the world did you do this? And he said, I don't know. And the doctor said, well, when did you notice this? And he said, when I was 10. And the doctor said, but that's impossible. He said, you don't have any idea what caused him? How could it look like this, 40 years later? And he said, I don't know. And the doctor said, looks like you have a case for the X-Files. If you can imagine. Now, this is a photograph I've shown many times, and this is a very bad cut. Most of these things are not this bad at all. And there are many, many abductees who don't have these marks on them. It's hard to know what the percentage would be, but it's certainly, I would say it's a minority. Maybe name a figure, 30 or 40% have these marks on them. But this man was 10 years old. Now we're getting into the school age time, where again, the child is supposed to be learning full competence at tasks, being able to operate within the world, solve problems, and so forth. And yet things happen to these children which work against the full flowering of those particular skills that we need to see if we're going to be developing in a normal way. This man, and I've shown this slide before, so if some of you are bored with it, I'm sorry, but it's a very good example. He's an African-American man who remembered going into the park in a small city and on his bicycle, and he remembered being in some kind of a white space. He had no idea where it was. And then when he came out, he was pushing his bike. He wasn't sure exactly where he'd been. He got home for dinner. He was extremely late for dinner and got in great trouble with his grandmother, who noticed on his T-shirt a couple of drops of blood. That was all that came from this cut. At the time this photograph was taken, he was 40, so had been there for 30 years like this, bad keloid scar tissue. He said that his grandmother pulled up his shirt and saw this horrible wound and said, you're going to the hospital, and he said, no, I'm not. And she said, but how did you do this? And he said, he remembered saying to her, I did it when I fell off my bicycle. And he's told me that as he said that, he said, I don't remember falling off the bicycle, but I was saying that to her, as if he was repeating something he had been told to say. He spent year after year in later years trying to find this white space in this park where he'd been riding his bike. He knew that there was a place there somewhere that he'd been inside. And when we finally got into this through hypnosis and he realized what had happened fully, his wife said, thank God, Bud, now we won't, when we go back to his hometown, we won't have to drive around in the park at night looking for that place. I've been doing with him all these years. But the reason he knew he hadn't fallen off the bicycle, there was no dirt on him, there was no tear in the T-shirt, and there was no bruise or anything suggesting it. But what I would like to again drive home is we're dealing with little children here who are very confused about what the world is made up of and who to trust and what to do and whether they are competent, whether they have the kinds of skills that they need in life. Who can you trust, etc., etc. And imagine, in terms of the trust issue, a child who is trying to tell what happened, these memories that they have, trying to tell it to their parents. And the parents are looking him straight in the eye and said, that didn't happen, you just had a bad dream. And the child then knows that I can't even tell my parents. And one of the reasons I think that abductees have such a problem of trust and forming relationships is because most of their relationships, in a certain sense, have betrayed them because they haven't been able, as little children, to tell the truth about what happened to them. It's extremely difficult. And you have a situation, things as bad as this, and the child is punished for it, for instance. You can see what's happening. Incidentally, one woman that I have worked with sort of woke up as a tiny child, and she was banging her head against the wall, and she had actually damaged her teeth and her nose, skinned her nose, and was forcing herself against the wall when her mother heard this racket and ran in. She was maybe 3. And her mother said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I'm trying to go through the wall." And she said, "But children, you can't go through a wall." She said, "Oh yes, I go through the wall." And at this point, she couldn't go through at that particular time. She wasn't given the magic Shazam, or whatever the word is you have to have before you go through the wall. So here's a child, again, in that story. Her mother is telling her, this, in effect, there's something the matter with you. This is your problem. It's not reality affecting you. This is some kind of imaginary problem you have. You don't go through a wall. And so it's no wonder that a child growing up has a tremendous number of problems in working out trust and a kind of way to interact with society. Now, looking at just a couple more slides, and then I want to get to the positive part, how we get out of all this. This is a drawing by Linda Napolitano's son, John. He was, I think, about 7 when he drew this. And it's a drawing I particularly love. He had remembered an abduction. This is all conscious stuff. He's taken in. He made this drawing for me afterwards. And that is, he points out, that's him in the middle. And the reason there are curving lines around his head and his mouth looks strange, he said, "My teeth were chattering and I was shaking because I was so scared." And very interestingly, there is a figure, an alien figure, sitting at the right at some kind of a console. And John said, "You know, he never even looked at me. He didn't turn around and look." Which is kind of an interesting, when a child says that, you know he's telling the truth. Simply because a child, if he's making it up and he's that little, he's going to be the center of attention. He was hurt that there was not even a look. And the man I was telling you about at the beginning, who videotaped his own, the machine that he was abducted into, described that when he was taken into the craft, he said, figures were moving around in this room doing one thing or another, and he said, none of them turned around to look at me. As if the whole thing was a kind of mechanical, as if he was, he later said that the wonderful image, he said, you know, what it looked like, the way they were moving around so purposefully and not relating to me and not actually treating me as if I'm not, they were treating me as if I'm not even there. He said, it was as if, he said, I went once into a big Italian restaurant and they had a great big window into the kitchen and you could see everybody moving around in the kitchen and shifting things and picking up plates and staying out of each other's way, and there was no communication. He said, that's what this looked like in this craft, a wonderful image. On the left side is, of course, an alien standing there, and I've pointed this out before. I think this is a wonderful drawing. The accuracy of children's thinking. He gives himself a nose, but you see the aliens are not given noses. He gives himself a mouth and teeth and a tongue. They have just a slit. He makes their face somewhat gray by putting in dots all over it. He gives himself hair. They're not given hair. But the most interesting thing is he draws their hands, his hands, the way children often do, is a series of little loops like a flower. At least my daughter did that, and lots of children do at some point. But he said their fingers were long and thin and pointed, and they only had 4. And he said, you know, they talk to you with their eyes. But at any rate, this child was extremely terrified, and the next day when he remembered all of this and told his mother, before he even got into this, he looked at her and he said, why don't you love me anymore? And she said, but I do love you. And he said, no, you don't, because while they were taking me, you were just standing there and you weren't doing anything. You weren't doing anything to help me. Now, this is another drawing that he did at another time, and it's a wonderful story. And then we're going to talk about briefly how all this can be mitigated, how you can work against it, and how the transformation, which is what we look for in every one of these cases. the transformation of that individual to get over these problems that have been laid upon them, so to speak. We'll get to that. And then we're going to have a period of questions. But first this. Little John came home from his parochial school, his Catholic school, and walked straight into his room and shut the door. And his mother had never seen him do this and was concerned. And the telephone rang, and it was Sister Teresa or somebody saying, "Your son was very bad, Johnny. He called me a liar today, and he called me a jackass." And I have always thought that's a wonderful sign of his upbringing, that in New York City, if that was the worst he could think to call somebody. On the farm maybe, but I don't know, in New York. But at any rate, Linda said she would deal with him, and called him in, and said, well, "Did you call Sister Teresa a liar?" And he said, "She is a liar." And he brought in this drawing. And he said the problem was that they were supposed to make a drawing for St. Patrick's Day. So they knew the story, so he drew the shamrocks and the toadstool and the pot of gold and the rainbow and the little people down there, and then he drew this up in the upper left corner. Sister Teresa said, "What's that?" And he said, "That's where the little people live." And she said, "There aren't any little people." And he said, "Yes, there are." And she didn't know what the line was going up, and she said, "There's no such thing as little people." He said, "They live in a spaceship." And she said, "No." And he said, well, you are lying then, and you're a jackass, because you were up there with me." And what happened? And Linda said, what are you telling the truth? What is this? And he said that he went out for recess. This is in New York City in the daytime, but these things can be unseen. And he said his shoe was untied, and he has a little trouble tying his shoes. So Sister Teresa bent down to tie his shoe for him, and he said then there was this bright light around him, and he said he went up. And he said, and Sister Teresa went up too, like she was stuck to my shoe. He said, like chewing gum. And they went into this thing through the bottom, and he said there were these people standing there, these little people. And Sister Teresa started screaming, but then she stopped, and he said they started taking off her clothes. And they took him into another room, and he doesn't remember what happened. This is all, of course, conscious memory. And when they brought him back, she was standing there looking, he said, like she was asleep with her eyes open. And her rosary beads, which she had used as a belt, was on the floor. And one of the aliens picked it up and gave it to him and said to give it back to her. I guess they didn't know how to put it around her, didn't want to do it wrong. And so he said, then we went down, and we got down into the schoolyard, and there was nobody there. He said, and we were late to school, so we went into class, and he said, we were late, however long this took. And but then he began to remember it all. And so Linda said, "Are you telling me the truth?" And he said, "Yes, Mom." He said, "I am." But he said, "I still have her rosary beads because I was afraid to give them back to her." And he went in the other room and brought them out and handed them to her. Now, you know, this is a belt which if it falls or drops, you would imagine you would be aware that it's not there. At any rate, look what this child is being put through, though. Now, here he was at this time, I don't know, 8 or 9, 7, 8, 9. He's in total confusion and doing battle with the religious superiors, his teachers. His mother didn't believe him at first. He could hardly believe this happened to himself. He doesn't know who these people are or what's going on. He really doesn't understand this. He's too little to understand it. And what things like this do, as a child is trying to grapple with becoming an adult, is extremely, extremely difficult. We can have the lights back on. That's the last of our slides. Now, what I would like to do, lest I've painted a gloomy picture here, But I think this picture has got to be painted because I think we have to understand what kinds of effects these experiences are having on people. And I would say it is universal for me that when I ask a person who has had abduction experiences a question like, when you were a kid in grade school and high school, did you have a good time? Did you have a lot of friends? Popular? Universally, people will say, oh, I kind of sort of stayed by myself a lot. I didn't have a lot of really good friends. I wasn't one of the popular ones. And there's that sense, well, of course, all of us think that the ones at the other table in the dining room are really having a better time than we are, no matter what. You always think that to some extent. But I think children who've had abduction experiences do isolate themselves when they go to school. They know that there's something that's happening to them that they don't understand, that nobody believes. They don't understand what it means. They have no idea what's going to happen. They have been, let's say, manipulated and lied to by the UFO occupants, and they have suffered marks and things. It hasn't been a pleasant experience. It's been magical and interesting, but it has a very strong downside. But the point is, who can they confide in? They can't tell the school counselor or Sister Teresa or whatever. So they end up, in a strange way, blaming themselves. The basic feeling, I think, that UFO abductees have about themselves is, as children and teenagers, is there's something the matter with me. I'm just different. There's something the matter with me. And I think, and I've been trying to demonstrate, that as you go through the stages of development, that a child should be mastering different levels of control and competence, hopefulness, and so forth. I think as they go through these things, and circumstances, their abductions are really conspiring to make it extremely difficult to move from one level of development to another, all kinds of problems are going to result, and that child is going to blame himself or herself. There is something the matter with me. And I feel that this is where we have to understand, when people have gone through these experiences, that they have started, everything has conspired really to keep them less efficient. People it's always been remarked upon how many UFO abductees do not have a job that is commensurate with their innate skills. They're working at a lower level in society than they should be. This has been commented on again and again by psychologists. And I think that this is the point where we understand the kind of help that has to be given to people. Now, what we want to do is to enact a transformation in those people's lives. If I didn't think, after 25 years of doing this work, that I couldn't work with somebody in a way that would help that person overcome some of these problems and live a fuller, richer life, I wouldn't be doing it. I simply wouldn't be doing it. And what happens is, I've used the term as the basic cluster of elements that can enact that kind of transformation. I call it benign human intervention. Benign human intervention. There are many steps in this, but in essence, this is what happens. The person, first of all, has to feel that they need to know what is really going on in their lives. They have to know what happened this crazy day. Why are they so afraid of something or other? I was dealing with a woman who told me that, and this comes up again and again, she had an incredible fear, she said, of all things, of people on stilts. And I said, is it that they're so tall? And she said, no, there's something about the way they move. And I said, well, I take it, this woman was in her 40s, I said, I take it that this is something you had as a child. She said, no, now, still. And I said, is this a very strong fear? She said, absolutely. She said, I took my children to Disney World recently, And she said, Mickey or somebody came out on stilts or some kind of a clown. And she said, would you believe I almost trampled 3 small children trying to run away? Women in their 40s, at the middle of Disney World. So, any rate, the person has got to feel, I want to explore this stuff. I want to know what happened that day when I remember X, Y, and Z. I want to know why I'm so terrified of people on stilts or what these issues are. There has to be a collection of things that leads that person to decide, I want to find out. I'm not going to continue with living a life which has so much fear, so many sleep disorders and so forth. I want to know. So the person has to show, first of all, I think, a tremendous kind of inner courage. The person has to want to know. And when I talk about benign human intervention, I'm really talking about, first and foremost, the spiritual resources of that human being. That person has to have the courage and desire to straighten out all of these dark places in their life that have been causing trouble all their lives. Now, the first thing is the person, let's say, makes that step and decides they want to look into it. Then the next step, of course, is who helps them look into it. And there you have to have somebody who is extremely understanding of that person's fears, hopes, wishes, etc. You cannot have a person who has an ideological bent to try to shape that in one given way. I have told the story many times before, and it's infuriating to me, about how a woman went to a support group where she was talking about these experiences and how upsetting, and she was told by members of the support group, you have no reason to be afraid that because you agreed to this in a prior life. And this woman was really most upset because her 13-year-old daughter was going through this. And she said, she was told, and you have no reason to be upset about your daughter because your daughter agreed to go through with this. This was a child who was afraid to go outside. She wouldn't go out after dark. She was going through all kinds of problems. And this woman was enraged because she was being told, you are not entitled to your feelings. You are not entitled to your feelings. And I told her, and I've said this many, many times, if anybody ever pulls that on you and says, you gave permission in a prior life, or whatever, you have struck some kind of bargain, or whatever, or you agreed to this, even though you don't remember it. I said, if they tell you that, you demand that person's wallet, house keys, and deed to their house because they promised you in a prior life that if you ever asked, they would give you all their worldly possessions. There's exactly as much evidence for that as there is for the other. So at any rate, the person has got to deal with people who are going to accept their emotions, their hopes, their angers, their fears, their whatever it is, even maybe their optimism, that this will all have a wonderful outcome. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. But whatever their feelings are about it, they're entitled to those feelings, and the person they're working with must do what he or she can to legitimize those feelings. And I have always made a point when I work with people, I shouldn't say always, but every time I can think to do it, to say to the person at some point when they're under hypnosis and they're on a table or whatever's happening, if they are in a calm mood at that point, and often, of course, when a person's taken inside, they can feel very almost euphoric, very calmed down, all kinds of things can be done. And at that point I will say, well, maybe you couldn't speak to the UFO occupants to ask them any question at that moment. Maybe you couldn't even really talk or think clearly. Or maybe you couldn't say what your feelings were or say anything to them. But let's assume right now you wanted to say something to them or ask them a question. What would you say? What would you ask? And of course, you're empowering that person who has been, up until that point, really unable to say anything, do anything. And now I've had people say in this very intense tone, leave me alone. Or in some sad voice, what are you doing this for? What is this? But at least under hypnosis, they're given a chance to respond, to deal with this in a verbal way. It's a way of trying to legitimize whatever that person is thinking and feeling and going through. So you want that person, after they have the courage and desire, need to find out what's happened, they try to find somebody who can help them, a facilitator, therapist, investigator, whatever. The next thing, of course, that they have to find, and this is something I absolutely encourage everybody, you have to find people in the real world, husband, wife, spouse, parents, friends, whatever, significant other, somebody in your circle who you could talk to frankly with this, who will give you support, who you know will give you support. Because you cannot do this on your own. This is something that requires being able to talk to somebody about it. And one of the first questions I ask people when I interview them is, who have you talked to about this? Do you have anybody in your family, anybody that you feel comfortable? Because you need that kind of support, because it's tough to do this alone. So that's the next stage, the next group, next level of this, what I call benign human intervention. And then, of course, the person is going to come up with a coping style. They're going to handle it in some way. And I think that the person, the facilitator working with them, has to understand that whatever coping style they come up with temporarily is maybe temporary, and maybe that's okay. If it makes them feel better and it's working, fine. In other words, a person, I've seen people who just are filled with anger. How can they do this? You know, like to wring their necks, you know, fury. Other people will say, you know, I think maybe they really have the best of intentions. They just don't know how to treat us right, and maybe it's all going to be fine, and it'll come out fine. And it was magical. That's fine, too. Some people want to become investigators themselves. Some people want to work with abductees. They want to have a buddy system. All of the, or perhaps even denial. This just can't have happened. It didn't happen. I'm sorry. Didn't happen. I just must have imagined all this. I have a very busy imagination. That's what it was. Any kind of coping style, at least in the short term, is a little float that can keep them from sinking into a lot of worry and despair and sadness. So they have to develop that coping system. And then, of course, ideally, a support group is just absolutely a terrific thing for people. For those of you who have been around a support group ever, if people are fair and let each other talk, and there's nobody who dominates things to the extent of with a particular point of view, which somehow denigrates other points of view, I think that's extremely helpful. But this kind of transformation begins to happen because of the presence of the human spirit in that individual, his own, her own strength, the people around them that they're able to work with. And at this point, I think the transformation can slowly take form. Now, there are those who believe that the transformation is being helped from the outside by the aliens. And that's just an ideological position that some people have. I've seen no evidence that I ever think is credible that that's going on. I think whoever they are and wherever they come from, they're doing their thing. I have never seen what I thought was a good, benign alien. I've never seen what I thought was an evil, malevolent alien. I just see this phenomenon doing its own thing, according to its own rules, trying to minimize, there's no doubt about that, trying to minimize the shock and damage that's done, but the shock and damage is very subtle and very real, and it's an enormous problem. But if I didn't think that lives have been saved, actually, by working with people, if I didn't think that, you know, the most wonderful thing is to see somebody stop talking about aliens and saying, I slept through the night and I'm really getting going on that a short story I'm writing. It's the best news I can possibly hear from somebody. Or that somebody is in a relationship that's working. Terrific. Well, listen, I think that we're going to have to wind this up because we want to get over to the cafe and so forth. And so I want to thank you again very much. Thank you.